Welcome to the 69th reading of my memoir, The Innocence of Guilt. Early days as a new mum. My blood pressure stayed elevated, so I wasn't allowed to go home. St. Stephen's being a teaching hospital, the doctor's rounds consisted of at least 5 of them standing around my bed each time. If I wanted more children, it would be wise to get pregnant as soon as possible and get the second baby over with before my condition worsened. With what I'd recently gone through, I wasn't thrilled at the thought of repeating it anytime soon, but a few days later my blood pressure subsided and I could have as many babies as I wanted, whenever I wanted. Jean, my friend from Baby's Bungalow, and one of the other nurses I worked with there visited. A panic attack swept over me. That weird twilight zone feeling, walls moving out, sense of unreality, nausea, the need to retreat. Always the same. I'd adapt to a strange routine as I had in the hospital, but as soon as something new entered the mix, my brain became overloaded and stressed. After 10 days, I was discharged. I dressed Karen in her own little clothes for the first time and laid her down on the bed to look at her. Perfect. Cute little round face, blue eyes, beautifully shaped head, and a fine down of fair hair. Traces of jaundice still lingered, resulting in a slight yellow tinge to her skin. It suited her. Instant tan. I told her we were taking her home at last, and soon she'd meet all the people in our family who were going to love her. I couldn't wait to show her off. Brian came to pick us up. He carried my case and the free bottles of formula the hospital forced on me by their policy of still not trusting that any mother could possibly keep her baby alive, except by a man-made substitute for the real thing. Cradling little Karen in my arms, I wobbled down the long hospital corridor, my body weak from bed rest and the effects of phenobarbital prescribed to keep my blood pressure at a reasonable level. The 16 internal stitches, aftermath of the episiotomy, burned like fire. By the time I climbed the stone steps to our flat, I was exhausted. For days afterwards, I fumbled around the flat in a stupor, unable to do much except take care of little Karen. Each morning, though, I woke and realized afresh that I had a little baby girl and went over to the bassinet and stared at her in wonder. Brian's parents visited, and he cooked a meal for them as I wasn't up to doing it. They didn't appear to be too pleased and expressed no sympathy for my weakness. When I put Karen discreetly to my breast, Brian's dad glared at me and said, "Could you do that in the other room, please?" Unprepared for such a request and too weak to state my rights in my own home, I toddled off to the bedroom to nurse her. If Brian thought it wrong of his folks to pack me off in disgrace, he didn't object. From behind the closed door, I could hear them warning him of the dangers of picking up a baby every time it cried. When I returned from nursing her, the consensus from the 3 of them was that I had to sit in the room with them and close the bedroom door on Karen. Forbidden to get up and attend to the needs of my baby, I endured the most horrible time. Afterwards, Brian told me he hadn't wanted to upset them, since they had come so far to see us, but the reasons went deeper. His mother raised twins all by herself during the war. Oliver didn't come home for 4 years, and so she must be the supreme authority on babies. My experience in the baby nursery at Bernardo's appeared to count for naught. For a while, after they left, Brian tried to impose his parents' restrictions on me by not allowing me to sit out in the lounge and watch television if I held Karen in my arms. He believed what his mother said, that a tiny baby knew how to take advantage of its parents. It hardly seemed fair, but my husband was influenced by his parents' expectation of him. He used appeasement in order to keep what he thought of as the peace. Where did that leave me? Undefended and betrayed. As soon as I gained some energy, we made a weekend trip to Colchester to present little Karen to her Nana and Uncle David. Din had been in Myland Hospital since January, so he didn't get to see her. It was a long bus ride out there, so we said we'd do that trip another time. We slept at Charnwood and everything went well until it came time to leave. Karen needed to nurse, but Brian's mum insisted on me packing while she let Karen suck for 20 minutes on her finger. I couldn't nurse her on the bus to my mum's place, too unseemly, and when I did get around to it, she was exhausted. She fussed and fretted, and I had to make up one of the bottles of the hospital formula I always kept handy, which she took easily. In the morning, back at home, I went to nurse her again, but she wouldn't take the breast. By giving her the bottle, I had ruined my chances at breastfeeding. I decided to see my GP and ask him to help me. In one way, I regretted going to him instead of the Childbirth Trust, but his surgery was close by, and I'd reached desperation point. My breasts were engorged and extremely painful. I faced him across his big desk, and he remained silent while I complained about my painful breasts and how I couldn't get my baby to nurse. He gave an unintelligible grunt and slid a container of pills across the desk to me. "Take these, and in 3 days you'll be fine." Problem solved. It wasn't what I'd hoped for, but after the milk dried up, bottle feeding, which Karen took too easily, gave me more time. Time to rest, time to go for walks with her in the pram, time to do the shopping. Brian could occasionally feed his little daughter too, which he appreciated. Still, I blamed my insensitive, interfering mother-in-law for my failure to breastfeed. Her whole attitude towards nursing had been negative, and I wondered if Brian picked it up from her, as he hadn't been entirely positive himself. I nursed Karen for only 3 weeks, but did my best, so I decided to put it all behind me. Mum paid another visit. We took a walk around the Chelsea streets, pushing little Karen in the pram. Brian had bought a Kodak Instamatic camera to capture all the precious moments as she grew. Although Mum still didn't like having her photo taken, I persuaded her to pose with her little granddaughter outside a gated garden. Typical of how our relationship worked, we ended up having another row, marring our time together. Mum wanted to go inside the garden, but I told her it belonged to the people who lived in the adjacent block of flats, the name of which was on the gate. A trust system operated in that only residents of that block used the garden, otherwise the entire population of London would be milling around in it. Mum thought it ridiculous. "We can go in. The place is empty. I'll bet that no one uses it." She fumbled with the latch of the gate. I stopped her, explaining that renters paid a higher rent for flats with gardens, such as this one, and that we who lived at Elm Park Mansions paid a lower rent because of our concrete paved courtyard. It wasn't fair for us to use a garden we hadn't paid for. Well, I would think a person could go inside a garden in the middle of London and sit and look at the flowers without getting into trouble, she moaned. I only desired she accept my part of London at face value. I was happy enough with it. In fact, more than happy. There were many small public parks scattered around, and the larger Battersea Park, across the Albert Bridge, a reasonable walk away. Typical of my mother, though, to want to break the rules and not accept the restrictions of society. I wanted to do things in the proper way. Observing how others close to me carried on their daily lives gave me the pattern for how to live mine. Jean lived near us, working as a nanny in Shaney Row. We took her up on her offer to babysit so we could go to the cinema. I didn't want to go, but Brian and I hadn't gone out much together in the last 3 months, so I gave in. Watching a violent western, nausea overcame me, and I couldn't wait to go home. Brian failed to understand my sensitivity since the birth of our baby. I was no more interested in going out than of going to the moon. Back in July, I'd watched the astronaut Neil Armstrong take his one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind on our small black and white television set, rabbit ears aerial, held up against the wall by Brian because it was the only position capable of picking up the signal. I'd been as awestruck as the rest of the world, but things were different now. Everything else paled compared to the miracle of my little baby girl. Having a baby of my own brought me joy and wonder, but also an awesome sense of responsibility. During the first few weeks, I checked her every so often to see if she still breathed, so afraid something would happen to her. One thing to work in a baby nursery, where I escaped into the bathroom when things overwhelmed me, knowing some other person would take over, but to be the sole person responsible for a tiny life? I took to phoning my doctor with trivial concerns. One time, I hurried with Karen to the surgery, certain she was seriously ill. The doctor grumpily said, "You've got her too heavily bundled up. Take some of those clothes off her before she suffocates." He must have thought me a pretty useless mother. The secret rituals still begged to be acted out in my head occasionally too, causing me wasted hours of worry when I ought to have been perfectly content with my life. After all, didn't I have now what I said I always wanted? A family of my own? Thank you for listening. Please feel free to subscribe, like, or comment on this reading, and hopefully you will tune in to the next one. Bye for now.